All right, so now we're going to be looking at 6. So 6 is the first score where it's actually like, okay, it gets the job done. Notice how it says satisfactory on the side here, because it meets standards, right? So it doesn't exceed standards, it just gets the job done, right? So think of the 6 as that, gets the job done. So it says it's an above average paper because a 5 is an average paper, right? If you want to get a upper level score, you need to be above average. And so it may be deficient in one of the essentials. It says mentioned above up here, but it may be less mature in thought. All right, so you're still looking at some potentially less fleshed out ideas, or less well handled in terms of organization, syntax, or mechanics. So they're acknowledging that there is some thought there. So like, as opposed to being more exclusively superficial down in the 5 down here, it is saying like there's some maturity, but think of it as like an uneven maturity. So descriptors might include less mature, some difficulties, but just above average. All right. So 6 is solidly average. So if you look more specifically about the organization is generally purposeful, but some sections are difficult to see connections to larger idea. So like the organization isn't just, like I said down here, bing, bang, bongo. Instead, the organization has some larger purpose. Like they're building, they are thinking about the relationship between their ideas. But sometimes it's difficult to see, like their organization sometimes is distracting, or they don't stay focused with that organization. Evidence is generally purposeful, so it still kind of lives in this way too specific or being way too abstract, but at least it's more clear than what the 5 is doing. The warrant is generally clear, but sometimes lacking. So again, it's got more of what a 5 has. And generally, it's just like a 5+, right? Answers the prompt, but not much of an argument with the larger purpose. So let's take a look at what that means. So, the 6 that you should be looking at is labeled V. So we're looking at V here. This is on page 179 in your packet. So the idea of disobedience or rebellion brought on by social or political injustice will bring about social progress that will benefit future generations, not only by change, but by example. So I can take a look at that. Oh, look, now it's giving me different colors. Fun. I can take a look at that and say like, okay, so they are telling me that brought on by a social or political injustice. Now I'm looking at the prompt, and the prompt does say to the extent in which Wild's claims are valid. So, okay, so they're telling me like this is when they're valid. They said like will bring social progress that will benefit future generations. And it says not only by change, but also by example. I'm not really sure like what that means of by example. I don't know, but okay. And I know what you're thinking, like, what? They didn't say anything about Oscar Wilde. They gave us all this information here, and this student doesn't write about any of it. Okay, don't poop your pants. You don't have to say Oscar Wilde in your essay. You simply have to address the idea of disobedience is a valuable human trait and promotes social progress. So this student is doing that. They're saying like, yep, disobedience and rebellion in the face of social or political injustice. They don't give me any specifics, so the introduction is there. The introduction is just their thesis. Okay, not great. It gets the job done. So I'm already at like a maybe 4 or 5. So let's continue and see what happens here. The idea of civil disobedience was brought about by author and activist Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau explored life for meaning and purpose and was determined to live in his own choices and avoid the agendas of others. So giving me some context. Not a great topic sentence, so I would say that topic sentence makes me a little sad because they're just giving me just general information about Henry David Thoreau. But then they start to tell me a little bit more about like, okay, that he lived, let me change this a little bit here. He explored life for meaning, and then he had purpose. He wanted to live on his own and avoid agendas of others. Okay, so potentially we are hinting at some disobedience. However isolated he was, he could never fully escape the government. As a pacifist, Thoreau protested wars and violence, and thus, during the Mexican-American War, refused to fund the violence and weapons, thus refusing to pay his taxes. So, here's what I'll say about this. Grammar is pretty poop-tastic, because they have the same, like, however isolated, blank, blank, then it says, and thus, like, kind of repetitive. I feel like this could be broken up, but okay, at least they're getting the point across about how, like, this is, like, how he was being disobedient. He refused to fund the violence and weapons. He refused to pay his taxes. So that's the disobedience. For this, Thoreau was then required to spend the night in jail. Although his action seems simple, it illustrates that disobedience can allow for justice. Thoreau later wrote of his imprisonment in his lecture called Civil Disobedience, which would influence future readers and leaders to follow their own beliefs and values, even if it requires disobedience or rebellion. This is good. This is what makes this in a higher paper. Like, they don't just say, look at, he was disobedient, isn't that fun? They say he was disobedient, and this is how it promoted social progress. He encouraged other people to follow their own beliefs. Now, the concept of social progress might be a little more vague there, because it's like, so what happens if they didn't follow their own beliefs? But at least this student is pointing in that direction. Unlike in the 5, where the 5 just told me, like, look at how these people are disobedient, this writer is saying, like, he was disobedient and it influenced others. Okay? So, let's continue on to the next body paragraph. Another example in which disobedience has allowed for social progress is the American Revolution. Such acts as boycotts or the Boston Tea Party made way for the creation of a free nation and a new democratic society. Look at that. Now they are showing me, what did they do? What did they do in order to be disobedient? Boycotts, Boston Tea Party. How did that create social progress? Well, in doing so, they created a free nation and a new democratic society. So the student has a specific example. They do not go into great detail, which frankly they didn't need to. They just told me about the boycotts. They identified the Boston Tea Party to show acts of rebellion. Now they tell me how the rebellion promoted progress through these areas, and creating a free nation and a new democratic society. The colonists' anger towards British tyrannical rule inspired their fight against injustice that allowed for the foundation of our nation today. Again, now they're being, as Max would love for me to say, more explicit. They're basically repeating what they just said, but instead saying, like, who are they disobedient against? But then continuing, although their actions were rebellious and disobedient to British rule, the colonists thought them necessary for their freedom. So this is a better paragraph than what I would say, like, the one above here. So, like, Thoreau a lot more specific than they probably needed to be, and they start to hint at the social progress. This one actually does. Says, like, because of their disobedience, they created social progress through there. Okay, by creating a new society. Okay. So continuing, while the American Revolution can be seen as a successful example of social progress due to disobedience, the revolution in France can be seen as a great imbalance. Particularly, it was described in the novel Tale of Two Cities. The bloody revolution sought too much revenge against the merciless elite, and the amount of beheadings became overbearing. Although their cause was just, the French lacked the discipline to balance their newfound rule. However, it did allow for a foundation to support social change. So, what this actually would be considered is more mature thought, and it's not executed very well. Let's totally admit that. For a 6, like less mature in thought or less well-handed in terms of organization, syntax, or mechanics. So, and this, I would say this part is experiencing some difficulties. And the reason I say that is because what they're acknowledging is like, yeah, I just told you how great all of this, how great the revolution was. But here, I really need to tell you that not all revolutions are great. So here, they're acknowledging, they are making a more nuanced position that yes, it can, but you need to temper what you're doing. And I know, we'll look at this and be like, they didn't say anything about that in their thesis. What a bunch of, this is sucky. Oh, I hate them. Like, this is totally an F. Remember what Miss Haynes said in class? That, yes, if you handed this paper in, you wouldn't get an above average grade because I would expect you to have a stronger thesis that reflects the rest of your paper. But the student had 40 minutes to write this, so okay, I'll cut them some slack. They are being more nuanced and saying like, yay, disobedience good, be careful, sometimes disobedience can be bad. So they're acknowledging that. And notice how they put it right next to the American Revolution. They did that purposefully. Like, look at the societal disobedience and what it did to help. It did, you gotta be careful because it doesn't always end up great. They do have this vague statement of like, however, it did allow for a new foundation to support social change. What? How? How did it do that? I have no idea. I get sad because you don't explain that enough. So, like, this is nuanced, but the execution is not great. So it's mature, but not really great. So let's continue. Another successful example of disobedience can be seen through the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks became the face of the movement after she refused to give up her seat to a white man. Although her actions were illegal, they were justified and honorable. This sparked peaceful yet rebellious movements like boycotts, sit-ins, marches, and more. All of these were disobedient yet sparked need for social change for equality. So, this student is using an example, which is a decent one, right? Rosa Parks. Remember that was on my list of like ones that everybody used. So, it's got an impact, but it's not as strong as if it was a little bit more unique. But okay, whatever. We got Rosa Parks, how she was disobedient, and then how that disobedience sparked other disobedience. And then it says all of these were disobedient yet sparked need for social change. They don't actually say what they did. Like something about like sparked the need. I wish that they would have said something like it more clearly as I would say, more explicitly articulated the civil rights movement or something along those lines. But this is a little bit of a vague, how does that promote social progress? All of these movements and rebellions prove the necessity of disobedience in order to spark progress in that society. However, it must be justified and properly balanced to be respected and effective. So the student ends with a pretty good thought. So notice how the 6 has good elements all throughout it, but oftentimes there tends to be like it falters here or there. So this is a solid 6 because it has organization. Some sections are more difficult to see the larger idea. The Thoreau section and the Rosa Parks section, not as strong. Evidence is generally purposeful. Yep, so like the Rosa Parks stuff, the Revolution stuff, the Thoreau was a little bit off. The warrant is generally clear, meaning like they connect it to social progress, but sometimes it's lacking because they don't really articulate that clearly. The only place they did that was talking about the creation of another society with the American Revolution. So those are what make it a definite 6.